Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Hyped about Hyperapp JS framework. I know all of you probably have better things to do than be here because none of you is using Hyperapp in production, I assume. And you could be actually learning about something useful like, I don't know, agile methods, C#, I don't know. But you picked me, and I assume it's because you probably know me from, I don't know, my blog posts, open source work, or maybe like my previous presentations. And all my presentations will be at slides.com. So even this deck will be there. The slides will be very, source code heavy. That's fine. But later you'll be able to just copy paste the code, and it will just work. I work for a company called Cypress.io. We make open source, MIT license, end-to-end test runner. We'll see it later, so it's not that important right now. But here's a situation. I was sitting at home one fine morning, drinking my coffee, and then someone, maybe my son or maybe my daughter came. I will protect their privacy. And the child said, "Hey, Dad, can you make me a game?" And the child is like 6 years old. So I was like, this is my moment to shine, right? Because me as a developer, I can never do cool stuff, right? But making a game, I was like, I got this. I know how to make games. Because in my life, I made 2 games on a web. One was a clone of 2048, where the cool thing was that at every moment, there are 2 new tiles that appear, so the game is really fast, right? And for that, I just cloned the existing 2048 and updated vanilla JavaScript, and it was simple. So that was one game. OK. And the other game I made, again, used vanilla JavaScript, where you could go to any GitHub profile, and you could play game of life using GitHub contributions. Again, simple thing, vanilla JavaScript, that was fine. But I started thinking, what could I actually do for my child? And I was like, OK, well, he or she is learning how to count. So why don't I make an arithmetic game that would actually gamify addition, subtraction, multiplication, and so on? So I was planning. I had my markers, my paper. And I realized that I don't want to just use vanilla JavaScript, because if I add more features, it will become a spaghetti code. So I need a framework. And there are a couple of major frameworks. We all love them. But they're not the only ones, right? In the real world, there are lots of choices. Some of them are good. Some of them are not as good. But pretty much every framework is usually a view layer and a data layer, right? A data store. So think like React and Redux, Angular, AngularX. Or usually it's like some framework and something that ends with X. I was like, fine, but like which framework should I actually use? And I actually done comparisons, and I've done work in many frameworks. But what I really didn't want is this, right? It's like a lot of code, a lot of boilerplate, a lot of configuration, just to get like simple thing that adds numbers. And a lot of people actually agree with me, right? Like the number of likes and retweets for this particular joke is super high. So what I picked for my side project was something called Hyperapp. It's a tiny framework. It's available on GitHub. It's made by a single person. He accepts pull requests. But it's this developer. So why did I pick this framework, and why I actually picked this framework for small projects of mine? Well, the description in the GitHub should actually intrigue you right away. It's 1 kilobyte JavaScript framework for building web applications. Now, we are kind of at the edge where like the pages are like megabytes of code, 10 megabytes of images, sound. Don't even start me on custom fonts. And I saw this 1 kilobyte. I was like, oh, that's already a winner. And then I read the blog post that actually introduced version 1.0 last December, and it made a lot of sense to me. So why am I excited? The way the framework describes its 3 main advantages is that it's minimal, it's pragmatic, and it's standalone. So what does this mean? Minimal means the author of a framework like kicked everything that's not really necessary out. You can be productive by just reading a README, looking at example, and that's all you need. It's pragmatic, it's functional, and you will see how the functional part plays, but it's pragmatic in terms of if you need a side effect, it's very easy to do. So think about functional frameworks like Elm, that inspired Hyperapp. In Elm, it's really hard to interop with other JavaScript libraries. Hyperapp, no. You want to be pure, stay pure. You want to do side effect, just do it. And finally, I don't need anything else. It's a standalone thing that includes everything like virtual DOM and data management, and I don't have to import anything else and think about which version goes with that. Right? Completely obliviates it. No dependencies needed. And size-wise, OK, so we get the big ones like Angular, like just the framework itself, and Hyperapp is this blue dot, kind of like Neptune sitting there. So the whole thing is just this. It's minified code, so I'll just give you like 5 minutes to read it to understand. No? OK, I'll turn on syntax highlighting. OK, now you can read it. That's it. That's the whole thing. It's slightly less than half of a page. And the way it works is this. And it's the same architecture as an Elm, only one part has been renamed. So we have data. The data sits in a model. That's the true thing that we want to represent. We represent it by projecting it onto a view. That's our DOM, our HTML. And when our users see the HTML, they look at the screen and they want to do something. They can, scream, turn around, run away. These are actions that propagate back to the model. Model gets updated, re-rendered to a view, and now users interact again, and the cycle repeats over and over again. By the way, Richard Feldman that said that, he's at a conference. He just did an excellent Elm UI talk. I highly recommend talking to him. He's a very smart person. OK. So there are only 3 components that we should discuss. The first one is view. It's the thing that renders our model and creates a DOM. So how does it look? So this is an example of a Hyperapp application. You have a single script that you have to import because it's standalone. You don't need anything else. And then from Hyperapp, you have a couple of things. There are only 2 functions that matter. One is age. It's a virtual DOM helper. And another one is app. That's what you actually use to start the application. Here's our view function. And it uses age to create an element of type div. You can pass attributes just like in any other virtual DOM framework. And the content. And the content could be text or other virtual DOM elements. In this case, it's just hello world text. So when this function runs, this view executes, it actually returns a simple plain object that describes a DOM element to make. It's not actual DOM element. The actual DOM updates will be managed by Hyperapp, so you don't have to worry about that. And then you start the application using the second function that the library provides, app. And in this case, we pass nulls as first 2 arguments, but we pass the view function as our third argument. And then we also have to say where we want that framework to actually attach that application, which means that you can actually have a big application, think Angular, React, but you can experiment with little Hyperapp widget just taking over a part of a page and just managing itself. It's so small, no one will notice. And by the time we discover it, it will be too late. It's already in production, so it will never be removed. Now, that was just view, just creating DOM elements from right now from nothing. But they have to render something. They need a model. So in Hyperapp terminology, it's called state. So state has a couple of things. First of all, it's just a plain object. This is like initial state. Let's say, so I come from Boston, so I'll say message Boston. And when I start the app, I need to pass that object. That's my initial data. And then look at this view. Instead of being 0 arguments, instead of taking nothing, it actually takes state as a first argument. That state will be passed by the Hyperapp. And it's not the initial one. It's the current that could be updated at this particular moment based on actions. So in this case, the current state is passed as an argument, and we can actually render it right here in hello message. So that will actually change depending on the current state. So hello Boston is rendered initially. Excellent. Actions. So now actions, they have to connect the state and the view, because the users actually look at the page and they want to do something. They want to click, they want to enter something. Maybe you want to fetch something from the server. So the actions do that. So first of all, again, everything looks like a simple plain object. So in this case, actions is an object, and right here, and all the properties are just plain functions. Okay? So in this case, I have just a single action, but there could be multiple properties, multiple actions. So right now it's on change, and it's kind of curried function. So the first thing is just arguments, usually an event, a top-level click event, input event. In this case, we don't really care. Well, we actually care. We will get the value from the input box. But the second argument is the current state. Because you're not only entering something, you probably want to look at what the current state of your application is, combine it, and do something. And the action just returns the new state. So you take the input event, you take the current state, and you produce the new state. And then that will be rendered by the view. So Hyperapp will make a turn of a rendering loop. So that's great. And not only the view takes the state as the first argument, it takes actions as the second argument. So the Hyperapp, when it calls your view function, it will give it current state and the actions object. And so now, for example, when you make an input element, you can attach an event listener on change and pass actions on change. So that's how you connect the actions back to Hyperapp, so it knows what to do next in response to the user actions. So you pass actions to the view, and then you just call them whenever you want. And now the whole Hyperapp app is complete. You use the app function provided by Hyperapp to start it. You pass initial state, you pass the actions object, you pass the view function, and where to attach itself. And now you have full live application. OK, I'm done. No? But now you can program pretty much everything. You can program the little counter app that I'll show later. That's it. And actually, I love the simplicity. Because you have a state, which is my data. The data gets rendered by a view. The user, in this case represented by this little symbol, looks at the view and dispatches actions. Clicks, changes, selections, which are mapped to actions, and the actions update the state, which gets rendered by a view, user sees the change, and so on, and it repeats and repeats. I love the simplicity because everything that I've shown so far, right, the view, the state changes, the actions, are all pure functions. Nothing from the view, used global, for example. Like you can, but you don't have to. So everything could be done using pure functions. For example, a view takes state and actions. In the whole function, it only looked at the state argument, which is right here, and the actions on change, which comes from here. It's completely pure function. The actions are not just past current state, but also the actions object as a second argument. So if an action wants to call another action, it can. It never has to remember actions in some global or shared object. Again, a pure function. And the pure functions are very, very easy to deal with. First of all, you can just read the source code and understand what's going on, because there is never a hidden this argument that can change React. It's easy to actually substitute and literally replace a text or code of a function with another function to understand if a function calls another function, what happens. You can understand the code just by reading it. And it's a great property. You can test them easily because the output of a function depends only on its arguments. If you call the function with the same arguments, it will always return the same result. It will never change from under you. And finally, it's easy to extend. You can replace one function with another, or you can attach something that will compose a function, right, and assemble more complex logic from simple pieces. And I love it because it's standalone. I never had to bring a separate library to do my state management and my view management. Right? This was already provided to me. And this all makes sense because it's the same function signature, right? The same principle, the same architecture. So I don't want to say that some frameworks are better than others, right? We all solve slightly different problems with slightly different approach. So this is the only slide in this presentation where there is a direct Hyperapp versus React plus Redux, right? And it's a good representation of verbosity of Redux that defines separate reducers and actions, right? Versus the simplicity of functions in Hyperapp. Now you might say, well, Redux provides serializable actions, for example, but who really serializes the actions and stores it? I can do the same thing in Hyperapp because all the functions are pure. I can literally take a function callback from an action, store it in a queue with a timer, and then pop it back and actually run it, and it will just work. So read this blog post. It's not mine, but it's excellent. It goes into comparison. OK, so here's the final result. And of course, it starts very, very easy, 0 minus 0. So I solved it. Great. Well, here I'm not sure, right? No. Yeah, OK. I got another one correct. Ooh, that's already kind of pushing it, right? So I built this app, pretty much no time. It took me longer to actually attach the styles, because I'm bad with styling stuff, but I ended up reusing most of outside styles. And I can switch languages, so Russian and English. And it's great. So my offspring played this game for a while. We actually competed. He used iPad, I used my phone, and we're like, who can reach 100 faster? And then we'll play it, OK, from 100 to 200, who can reach faster? And now he or she is good at counting, which was my goal. I was like, oh. And he's like, oh. And then he's, oh, Dad, make me a maze game. I was like Pac-Man. I was like, ah. I was like, OK, Pac-Man, right? It's like, let's write a serious app, right? The counting was serious, simple. Now, let's make a serious Hyperapp app. And in order to make a serious app, you need three things. First of all, you need a good mustache and beard. Second of all, you need a way to organize your code, because you cannot just put it in a single file, right? It doesn't scale quickly. And you need a way to test that, because you'll come back later to add a feature, and you don't want to lack a confidence to change something. And if you don't have tests, you don't have confidence. So we need a way to actually test this very well. So first of all, instead of putting everything into a single app.js, or even inside index.html, you can split everything, all your states, all your actions, and view, and have just app.js that kind of connects everything. Because everything is a pure function, and everything is just a plain object, you can do that. Each part is separate. They don't have to live together. So that's app.js. And my index.html is just a single script tag. It could have style tags, for example, right? So how do I actually run this? Well, the simplest thing that I found to work with Hyperapp is this bundler called parcel bundler. So you npm install parcel bundler, and your command to actually execute this file is just parcel serve HTML. And it happens just like magic. It just understands the script tag. It goes, discovers all the dependencies, bundles everything up, and when it's ready, and you open localhost 1234, and it has unique script tag, and it has source maps, everything. It just works. And if you want to actually put this in production, instead of parcel serve, you use parcel, build, and it outputs a dist minified bundle with source maps. And if you had styles, it will do the styles, everything. 5 minutes, and you're all set to go. Now, not only parcel, a pleasure to work with like that. I use this H helper function to do my virtual nodes, but people like JSX. I understand why. It's kind of the same HTML notation. So you can write your view function using JSX. You just have to import H from Hyperapp. And when you do parcel through npm start, guess what? Parcel will understand everything. It will install a plugin. It will compile everything back from JSX to H function. And then you get your code with source maps. This version of Chrome doesn't even understand import yet, but it still works. You don't have to install anything. Another thing that I highly recommend in a serious app is to use TypeScript. I was not a big believer in TypeScript for like 3 years. I was like, oh, it will just slow me down. I like to hack things. I don't care what compiler says, right? Because I came from C++. The compiler was just my enemy all the time. But I have to admit, in JavaScript world, TypeScript actually is an improvement. So if you want to do your Hyperapp using TypeScript, just rename your files from GS to TS and give them types. So if you want to say that your state can only have message as a string, just do that. And then if you try to type something incorrectly, the TypeScript help in VS Code or any editor, or when you actually try to run it, will tell you, hey, you made a mistake. This makes application programming so much easier and so much faster. Now, this assumes a TypeScript plugin, right? Well, guess what? First of all, Hyperapp by itself includes TypeScript definition. So you already get help there. And second, the parcel just automatically notices that you're using TypeScript. It will install TypeScript language plugin. It will install TypeScript itself. It will reload itself if you're already running it, and it will just continue working. It's pretty amazing. Trying to configure things. Remember that big board with all the diagrams and Webpack configuration? None of it. For majority of cases, just do what you want, and it will just work. I'm not selling parcels, so I don't work for them. OK. A couple of tips. So if your state has sub-objects like foo and bar, and they have different things, your actions can also have foo and bar, and all the actions there, like this state, will not be the full object, but whatever was the foo here. So it's nice because you can actually compose big actions and big state out of small sub-apps, and they will still work. And that magical app function that Hyperapp gives you, it actually returns a value. So you can save it as _app, and this value is just an object with all the actions. So you can call them yourself, which is really convenient from DevTools. If you're trying to debug something, and you're like, oh, I wish I could trigger that action with this argument, like right now, you can do it by just calling it on this return result. You can have, how does it react? Pure functional components, not just do them. You don't need anything else. And then you can use them inside your big view function, so you can split it up. Here's a pragmatic approach, right? So imagine you click something and you want to fetch something from the server. Well, the click is an action. It can go and do the side effect. It can go to the server, and when it gets result, it just calls another action, which will actually update the state, and then it will be re-rendered. So you want to do side effect? Go ahead. Who cares? Right? It will be ready when it's going to be ready. The second part of serious app is testing it, right? So for testing, we usually do end-to-end or unit testing. For end-to-end, I highly recommend our open source Cypress. Kind of looks like this. You just say site visit whatever your domain where your app is running, and get some selector and click on it, just like a user would do. OK, so let's try this. So usually setting up Selenium, Nightwatch, you name it, Cucumber, takes a while, right? You have to, like, it has to be the right time, the right phase of the moon, everything. Here it's much simpler. So we're going to install a couple of dev dependencies. So the Cypress is the test runner. Start server and test is a small testing utility, and then the parser bundler that we used before. Our scripts in package.json, well, start will be just our regular parcel serve. Our test will run Cypress run, which runs Cypress in headless mode. So it will not even start, it will just run headlessly. And our CI script will use server test that comes from here. This utility starts the server in the background using npm start, waits for this port to respond, because the real app takes time to bundle and to start, so it's not trivial. So this will continuously test this port or this domain URL, and when it starts responding, then it will run the tests, and when the tests finish, it will shut down the server. So with a single command, you can do everything and get result. And here's a typical test. You know, before each test, you want to visit that localhost 1234, which is what parcel does by default. When you want to get the input box, type something, and then check that the text that you expect actually appears. So this is the whole end-to-end testing story on a single slide. Just copy-paste it in your shell, and you'll be good to go. And the test will look like this. You see the commands here. You see the actual iframed website. So you have a visual thing. So for example, these are the tests for my count app. And this is actually the real time. That's how fast it runs, right? So it actually starts each test with a new iframe, loads the website, and does a bunch of actions and checks the results. So it's pretty fast. OK, enough with end-to-end. Sometimes we just want to work on components, right? You have a big view function. You split it into components. How do you actually work with tests for each component? You don't want to do things like Enzyme. You don't want to do JS DOM. You really want the real browser. So you can use Cypress, which gives you a real browser. You just have to install a plugin specific to Hyperapp. And then you can mount your view function. And this will bundle everything. But you don't have to start a separate server. And then you can interact with that app. And you can read more about this in a README. So if you want to learn about testing, a couple of resources. They are specific to Hyperapp. So this person, they actually did Hyperapp refactoring, and used Cypress to do that. Now, I just want to finish and spend a couple of minutes on what's coming. So what we saw was Hyperapp version 1 that was released December of last year. The Hyperapp V2 will be very different, OK? And apparently, it's coming in December 2018, which is next month. We'll see. The time estimates are always hard. And it will change a bunch of stuff. And the pull request to do V2 actually is pretty good, because it links everything, and then everything is described in detail, and there is discussion, and it's going back and forth like a typical GitHub discussion for like hundreds of messages. But anyway, the most important ones that I think are interesting. In V1, when you change the state in an action, you don't have to return the full object. You can just return whatever changed. OK? And it will be merged with existing state object. So if on change, you only change the message, just return that property. And if on increment, you only change the count. See, like in this state, there are two of them. Just return this thing. It's kind of a nice little trick. It cuts down on code. You only deal with what you really want to deal. But in V2, we are changing this, right? And they're changing it because now ES6 is everywhere. There is a spread operator. It's so easy for you to actually merge the state the way you want to merge it. Otherwise, it was really hard to actually delete a property. How do you return a property that was deleted, right? You had to create a bigger state object and then remove a property there. So in V2, you have to explicitly return the full state object. But I don't think it's a big change. The biggest change would be actions. So think about React or Hyperapp V1. When you have on-click handler, you actually, if you pass just actions increment, or if you call it yourself, you are calling that action immediately, right? You actually imperatively tell, hey, execute yourself, okay? Which is fine. Most frameworks do that. But it actually presents a problem. If you're trying to implement a middleware, or if you're trying to compose actions, this imperative approach that just executes the function immediately is not going to work very well. You'll have to jump through all the hoops, like think higher order components that have to like intercept actions. So in V2, instead of calling a function, you actually attach a handler that's just, you see, this is an array, right? A tuple. And you pass reference to the action that you want to execute and any argument. So you don't actually increment, you don't call it. You declare that on this event, this action needs to be called with this argument. So you are actually making Hyperapp a lot more declarative, where things are lazy, where things don't happen immediately. Instead, you just say, well, I want this to happen, please. But this makes testing it and extending the app a lot simpler. And the same way, when you execute an action, let's say the action has a side effect. You can still do side effects like we did before. Just do it, and then call an action and say, just change the state. Or you can do something else. So here's an action that sends HTTP request. When you send HTTP request, you want probably to update the state to say like loading or error null, preparing for possible error. But you also want to state or declare that, hey, this particular action has a side effect. So you do it by not just returning the state object. You return, again, a tuple. And the first argument is the updated state immediately, right? And the second parameter in that array is the side effect. And the side effect comes from utility that actually implements it. So instead of you immediately kind of doing side effect, you say, hey, change the state, and I declare that I want to do this effect. And this, again, makes the whole framework and the app more testable, but harder to understand and harder to transition from, let's say, React or Vue or Angular, where things just, hey, here's a command. And to me, this is interesting because the Hyperapp V2 makes the framework a little bit more complex and a little bit more like another framework that I actually tried using called Cycle.js, where everything is a stream. Everything is pure. You cannot be pragmatic like in Hyperapp. But Hyperapp is kind of moving it, but not all the way. So for me, I still think I still will use V2, but I have to see how it actually changes my day-to-day work on my side projects, if I actually like it, or if I'm going to stick with V1. And I can, even before V2 has been released, there is a framework that appeared called Ferp, which takes the concept of Hyperapp V2 and Elm and just implements it. And it's such a nice trick because everything is a declarative, everything is a side effect that you just say you want. But this framework actually works on a server, so you can implement your server code, or in a browser, because the DOM is also a side effect. So there are examples for both the server-side programming and client-side apps, so which is really interesting. It kind of tells you that if you keep postponing official release, people will just do it before you, right? And just say, hey, we've already done it. Like you've been like sitting on this for too long. OK. So in conclusion, Hyperapp is absolutely a simplest framework you can just start using after half an hour, or just like opening these slides and trying to code it, like on the second screen. I guarantee it. It's much simpler to learn. It's much simpler to use. And it's like a joy to organize and test and work with. And just as a bonus, I suggest that you try using Parcel Bundler. If you used to like Browserify or Webpack or even Rollup, right, you'll be pleasantly surprised. Because it will just magically do everything you're trying to do, and you don't have to tell it. And I just want to thank you for sticking around. And here are the slides, and the Hyperapp is there. And I have a couple of blog posts about Hyperapp examples. And if you want to talk to me, I'll be available after this talk. Thank you. Thank you very much.